September 3rd, 1944, a convoy of military trucks rolled through the entrance of Camp Aliceville, Alabama, carrying cargo that would expose one of the most profound differences between two warring nations. Inside sat 67 German prisoners of war, captured during the Normandy invasion, and transported across an ocean to a country they had been told was starving and collapsing under the weight of war. They were exhausted, malnourished, and completely unprepared for what they were about to witness. As the trucks came to a stop in the processing area, the prisoners were ordered out for their first meal on American soil. What happened in the next 90 minutes would shatter everything they believed about their enemy and ultimately transform their understanding of the war itself. Before we discover what made these hardened soldiers weep in disbelief, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 26-year-old Klaus Müller sat on the bench in the mess hall, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for whatever meager rations the Americans would provide. He had served as a Wehrmacht corporal in the 352nd Infantry Division, defending the beaches of Normandy with the conviction that Germany was fighting a righteous war against nations too weak and morally bankrupt to feed their own people. He had been told that America was suffering from massive food shortages, that their soldiers were undernourished, and their citizens were rioting in breadlines. He had been told that the American war machine was running on fumes, sustained only by stolen resources from conquered territories. As a guard approached with a metal tray, Klaus braced himself for the tasteless gruel or stale bread he had been eating for months. What was placed before him instead made him freeze, his eyes widening in complete incomprehension. The tray held more food than Klaus had seen in a single meal in over 2 years. A thick slice of meatloaf, easily 4 ounces of real beef. A generous scoop of mashed potatoes with a pat of butter melting on top. Green beans, not withered or preserved but fresh. 2 slices of white bread with another pat of butter. An apple, unblemished and shining. And a glass of milk, actual milk, cold and white and impossible. The abundance was obscene. Klaus stared at the tray, then at the American guard, then back at the food, trying to reconcile what his eyes were seeing with everything he had been taught. This wasn't prisoner rations. This was more than he had eaten as a soldier fighting for the fatherland. Around him, the other German prisoners were having identical reactions. 19-year-old Hans Weber, who had been conscripted straight from his family's farm, whispered in German, his voice breaking. "This is what they feed prisoners. What do they feed their soldiers?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and terrifying in its implications. If their captors could afford to feed enemy prisoners this well, what did that say about German propaganda? What did that say about Germany's chances of winning this war? But it was 34-year-old Sergeant Ernst Vogel who noticed something that would become the defining observation of their captivity. Through the mess hall window, he could see American soldiers at their own tables, eating from similar trays. And as he watched in growing disbelief, he saw soldier after soldier finish their meal, stand up, and scrape half-eaten food into large garbage bins. Potatoes barely touched. Meat with only a few bites taken. Whole slices of bread, discarded. Fruit, thrown away as if it had no value at all. Ernst's fork clattered to his tray. "They are throwing it away," he said in German, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby prisoners. "The Americans are throwing away food." The morning of September the 4th brought the prisoners their first full day in the camp routine, and with it more opportunities to observe the incomprehensible abundance of their captors. Breakfast was another shock. Eggs, scrambled and generous. Bacon, crispy and plentiful. Toast with jam. Orange juice, a luxury Ernst hadn't seen since before the war. And coffee, real coffee, not the bitter ersatz substitute Germans had been drinking for years. Klaus forced himself to eat slowly, his stomach unaccustomed to such richness after months of near-starvation rations. Around him, other prisoners were doing the same, their faces reflecting a mixture of gratitude and growing shame. How had they been so wrong about everything? As the meal ended and prisoners began clearing their trays, the Germans watched in horrified fascination as American soldiers casually discarded uneaten portions. A young private, barely 20 years old, threw away 3 strips of bacon and half his eggs. Another soldier dumped an entire piece of toast, having apparently decided he was full. The waste seemed criminally thoughtless, almost obscene to men who had watched civilians starve in occupied territories. Hans approached Ernst during the walk back to their barracks, his voice low and confused. "Why do they waste so much? Don't they know people are starving?" Ernst had no answer. The abundance, the careless waste, it spoke to a kind of wealth and security that shouldn't exist in a nation supposedly struggling to sustain a global war. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Private Robert Chen had been assigned to guard duty at the German POW compound, and he had begun to notice something odd about the prisoners' behaviour during meals. They ate slowly, deliberately, as if each bite was precious. They cleaned their trays completely, leaving not a scrap of food behind, and they watched the American guards with expressions that looked almost like grief whenever food was thrown away. At 24 years old, Robert had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the son of immigrants who had known hunger and deprivation. He understood the value of food in a way many of his fellow soldiers didn't. He certainly understood the psychology of watching abundance being wasted when you had known scarcity. During a shift change, Robert approached Sergeant Miller, the camp's mess supervisor, with an observation. "Sarge, I think the German prisoners are disturbed by something. They keep watching us throw away food, and they look genuinely upset about it." Miller, a career military man from Iowa, considered this information. He had been running mess operations in various capacities for 15 years, and he had developed an instinct for understanding how food reflected cultural values. "The propaganda probably told them we were starving," Miller said thoughtfully. "Imagine being a prisoner of war and discovering your enemy is so wealthy they throw away more food than you've eaten in months. That's got to mess with your head." Robert nodded slowly, beginning to understand the psychological weight of what they were witnessing. These German soldiers weren't just prisoners. They were men confronting the collapse of everything they thought they knew about the war. The breakthrough came on September the 7th during a work detail in the camp's warehouse facility. Klaus, Hans, and Ernst had been assigned to help organize supply deliveries alongside 8 other prisoners. Sergeant Miller supervised the detail, watching as crate after crate of food supplies was unloaded from trucks. The volume was staggering. Enough canned goods to feed a small city. Sacks of flour and sugar stacked to the ceiling, crates of fresh vegetables that would spoil if not used within days. The prisoners worked in silence, but their faces told the story of men having their worldview systematically demolished. Miller noticed Klaus staring at a crate of oranges, his expression haunted. The sergeant walked over, his approach deliberate and non-threatening. "You're wondering how we have so much," Miller said in slow, clear English. The prisoners had been picking up English phrases, and Klaus's education had included some English study. He looked up at the sergeant, then back at the oranges. "Yes," he admitted in heavily accented English. "In Germany, orange is like gold. Here, you throw away." Miller nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We have a lot of land in America," he explained, keeping his words simple. "A lot of farms, a lot of industry. We make so much food, we have extra." He paused, then added gently, "More than we need." Klaus processed this information, his face reflecting the painful realization washing over him. Propaganda say America is weak, hungry, no resources. Miller's expression shifted to something resembling sympathy. "Propaganda lies," he said simply. "On both sides, but some lies are bigger than others." The statement hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that both nations had deceived their citizens, but that the scale of deception was drastically different. For the first time since his capture, Klaus felt something beyond fear or shame. He felt anger, Not at his captors, but at the leaders who had sent him to fight for lies. November 24th, 1944, brought an event that would crystallize the German prisoners' understanding of American abundance in a way that statistics and daily observations never could. Thanksgiving Day. Captain James Richardson, the camp commander, had debated whether to include the German prisoners in the traditional feast. After consultation with his staff, he decided that demonstrating American values through generosity would serve a greater purpose than any lecture or re-education program. The prisoners were informed through their interpreter that they would participate in a special American holiday celebrating gratitude and plenty. Nothing could have prepared them for what appeared on their plates that afternoon. A whole turkey breast, tender and juicy, easily 8 ounces of meat. Stuffing rich with herbs and butter. Mashed potatoes and gravy, candied yams, cranberry sauce, green bean casserole, fresh baked rolls. And for dessert, pumpkin pie with whipped cream. It was more food than Klaus had seen his entire family eat at Christmas before the war. It was an abundance that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, in a nation supposedly stretched thin by global conflict. Hans stared at his overflowing plate with something approaching horror. "This is real," he whispered to Ernst in German. "This isn't propaganda or special treatment. This is just what they have." The older sergeant nodded slowly, his own emotions clearly overwhelmed. Around them, other prisoners were reacting in various ways. Some ate with focused intensity, as if afraid the food would disappear. Others sat frozen, unable to process the cognitive dissonance. One young prisoner, barely 18, began crying quietly, his hands covering his face. The abundance, the generosity, the casual nature of it all. It was breaking something fundamental in their understanding of the world. After the meal, Captain Richardson addressed the assembled prisoners through the interpreter, explaining the tradition of Thanksgiving and its meaning in American culture. A day to acknowledge blessings and abundance, a celebration of harvests and prosperity, a recognition that there was enough to share. As the words were translated, Klaus watched several American guards casually scraping half-eaten portions of turkey and pie into waste bins. The disconnect between what Germans considered precious and what Americans considered disposable was laid bare in that moment, stark and undeniable. Private Chen approached Ernst during the afternoon recreation period that followed the feast. The German sergeant had ventured outside to walk off the enormous meal, his expression troubled. "Sergeant Vogel," Chen said carefully, having learned the prisoner's name over the past months. "May I speak with you?" Ernst turned, his face showing the strain of the day's revelations. "Yes, Private Chen. I know your name too." They walked together along the fence line, an unusual pairing, but one that had developed naturally through mutual respect and Chen's obvious empathy. "You seem troubled by the food," Chen said, not quite making it a question. Ernst was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts and his limited English vocabulary. "When I was soldier in Russia," he began slowly, "I see civilians starve, children with no food. We have little food too, but orders are orders. We take what villages have." His voice grew heavy with remembered guilt. "I tell myself, everyone is suffering in war. Americans too, British too. Everyone is hungry, everyone is desperate." He gestured back toward the mess hall. "But here, you throw away more food than those children ever see. What does this mean?" Chen considered his response carefully. "It means the war is not equal," he said quietly. "Germany is fighting with everything it has. America is fighting with a fraction of what we have. We have so much, we can afford to waste it." The brutal truth of that assessment hit Ernst like a physical blow. "Then Germany cannot win," he said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. Chen's silence was answer enough. The two men stood together, enemy and captive, both understanding that they were witnessing something larger than military might. They were seeing the fundamental inequality of resources that would decide the war's outcome long before the final battle was fought. December brought colder weather to Alabama and a gradual shift in the camp's atmosphere. The initial shock of abundance had evolved into something more complex. Real conversations, hampered by language barriers but rich in meaning, began happening during work details and recreation periods. Klaus found himself increasingly drawn to these exchanges. His English improved daily, and with it came the ability to ask questions that had been haunting him since that first shocking meal. One afternoon in early December, he approached Sergeant Miller during a supervised work detail in the camp's equipment storage area. "Sergeant," he began carefully, "may I ask something?" Miller nodded, setting down the inventory clipboard he was holding. "I want to understand," Klaus continued, struggling with the vocabulary. "Why you show us this abundance? Why you let us see you throw away food? You could hide this from us." Miller leaned against a storage rack, his expression thoughtful. "Because," he said slowly, "lies only work in the dark. If we hid our abundance, you could still believe the propaganda. You could still think Germany had a chance to win." He looked directly at Klaus. "The truth is harder, but it's also kinder. Better you understand now than keep believing lies that will get more people killed." Klaus absorbed this, his expression pained. "So this is psychological warfare. Break our spirit with your wealth." Miller shook his head. "No. This is showing you reality. What you do with that knowledge is up to you." He paused, then added, "Some of your fellow prisoners are angry about the food waste. They've written letters to their families back in Germany, telling them about it. Those letters get censored, but the censors report what's in them. You know what most of them say?" Klaus waited. "They say, 'Tell everyone to stop fighting. America has so much, we cannot win. They are not evil. They are just stronger.'" The words struck Klaus with the force of revelation. His fellow prisoners were doing what he had been too frightened to do. They were accepting the truth and trying to save lives with it. January 15th, 1945, brought news that would shatter whatever remained of the German prisoners' illusions about the Reich's chances of victory. American forces pushing through Europe had begun documenting the full extent of Germany's resource exhaustion. Images and reports filtered back to the States, and military intelligence decided that German POWs should see what their homeland was facing. Captain Richardson arranged for a special assembly, where prisoners would view photographs and read translated reports about conditions in Germany. The prisoners filed into the recreation hall, confused about the sudden assembly. Captain Richardson stood before them, his expression grave. "What you are about to see," he said through the interpreter, "is difficult. These are photographs and reports from Germany. This is what your families and neighbors are experiencing while you eat 3 full meals a day here." The projector clicked on, and images filled the wall. German cities reduced to rubble. Civilians with hollow eyes and gaunt faces showing signs of severe malnutrition. Children rummaging through garbage for scraps. Bread lines that stretched for blocks, where people waited hours for a single small loaf. Farms stripped bare, with nothing left to harvest. The systematic collapse of a nation's ability to feed itself. Klaus felt his stomach turn. He had known Germany was struggling, but seeing the extent of it while remembering the turkey and potatoes he had casually eaten days before was almost unbearable. Beside him, Hans was trembling, his hands clenched into fists. Ernst sat perfectly still, tears streaming down his face in silence. The images kept coming, German soldiers in tattered uniforms, looking skeletal and desperate. Military rations that consisted of a few ounces of black bread and watery soup. Hospitals with no medical supplies, where wounded soldiers lay on bare floors because there were no mattresses, no blankets, no basic necessities. When the lights came back on, the room was filled with men in various stages of emotional collapse. Some were crying openly. Others sat in shocked silence. A few looked physically ill, their faces pale and sweating. The interpreter began to speak, but Captain Richardson raised his hand to stop him. "I know this is hard," the captain said quietly, "but you deserve to know the truth. While you have been here, eating American food and sleeping in heated barracks, your countrymen have been starving, not because America is deliberately causing suffering, because Germany's resources are gone. The war has consumed everything." Ernst raised his hand, a gesture of profound respect given his rank and the circumstances. Richardson nodded at him. "Sir," Ernst said in careful English, "my family in Dresden. Can you tell me if they are safe?" The captain's expression grew even more somber. "Dresden was heavily bombed in February. I don't have specific information about survivors. I'm sorry." The words were gentle, but their impact was devastating. Ernst nodded slowly, his face crumbling. Private Chen, standing near the wall, moved forward instinctively, placing a hand on the German sergeant's shoulder in silent support. That night, the barracks were filled with quiet crying and whispered conversations. The prisoners held each other, trying to process the impossible guilt of having been safer and better fed as prisoners than their loved ones were at home. Their jokes about American food waste seemed grotesque now, childish observations that missed the deeper tragedy. While they had been marveling at abundance, their families had been starving. The knowledge would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The weeks following the assembly were the darkest period in the camp's history. The German prisoners moved through their daily routines like automatons, mechanically performing tasks, but showing none of the gradual adaptation that had been developing. The guards noticed the change and were largely at a loss for how to help. Even acts of kindness seemed inadequate in the face of such profound survivors' guilt and grief. By early February, Captain Richardson was genuinely concerned about the prisoners' mental health. Some had stopped eating properly, unable to swallow food while knowing their families were starving. Others barely spoke, lost in private hells of guilt and helplessness. It was Klaus who finally found a way forward, though not in any way anyone expected. On February 18th, he approached Captain Richardson with a proposal that caught the commander completely off guard. "Sir," Klaus said in his now fluent English, "I want to work. I want the prisoners to work, real work, and I want our wages sent home to Germany to help feed people." Richardson was taken aback. POWs did work in various capacities, and they were technically paid nominal amounts, but Klaus was proposing something more. He was asking to contribute, to be useful, to do something that might alleviate even a fraction of the suffering they had witnessed in those photographs. The captain brought the proposal to his superiors, who were intrigued by the psychological implications. If German prisoners wanted to work harder and send money home, it served multiple purposes. It kept them occupied and purposeful. It contributed to the American war effort through labor. And it demonstrated American magnanimity in allowing them to help their families. Permission was granted. Klaus was allowed to organize a voluntary work program where prisoners could take on additional agricultural and construction labor in exchange for modest wages that would be converted to care packages sent to Germany. The response was overwhelming. 58 of the 67 prisoners volunteered immediately. They threw themselves into the work with intensity that surprised their American supervisors. These were men who needed to do something, anything, to justify their own survival and comfort. They worked in fields, harvesting crops that would feed both Americans and Allied forces. They built structures and repaired equipment. They labored with dedication that went beyond duty, driven by guilt and love and a desperate need to contribute something positive to a world they had helped destroy. Private Chen watched Klaus in the fields one afternoon, impressed by the former corporal's leadership and work ethic. "You drive yourself hard," Chen observed during a water break. Klaus wiped sweat from his face, his expression determined. "Every extra dollar I earn, every extra pound of food that gets sent home because of our work, that might save someone. Maybe not my family, Maybe they're already gone, but someone's family, someone's children. He looked at Chen directly. In Russia, I took food from people who needed it. I can never undo that, but maybe, in some small way, I can balance the scales. By March, the voluntary work program had become one of the camp's defining features. American newspapers picked up the story, fascinated by the image of German POWs working voluntarily to help feed their defeated nation. Some Americans felt it was inappropriate for prisoners to be shown such consideration. Others, particularly those who had lost family members in the war, felt conflicted about showing mercy to former enemies. But Captain Richardson defended the program vigorously. "These men have accepted reality," he wrote in one report. "They understand they lost. They understand why. Now they want to help fix the damage. That's not weakness. That's the beginning of real peace." May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, arrived with complex emotions at Camp Aliceville. While Americans across the country celebrated in the streets, the German prisoners faced the reality of repatriation to a devastated homeland. Official orders had come from Washington. Most would be returned to Germany within months, processed through displaced persons camps before being released to whatever remained of their former lives. Captain Richardson called a General Assembly on May the 20th to announce the details. The 67 men gathered in the recreation hall where months earlier they had seen the photographs of Germany's suffering. "Transportation will be arranged within the next 8 weeks, Captain Richardson announced. "You will be given documentation, basic supplies, and passage to European ports. From there, you will be processed and released to return to your homes." He paused, his voice softening. "I want you to know that you have conducted yourselves with dignity here. You have worked hard and shown remarkable character in difficult circumstances." Several men shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise from a former enemy. Klaus raised his hand, speaking without waiting for permission. "Captain, what about the work program? Can it continue until we leave?" The question surprised Richardson, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "Yes," he said after a moment. "You can continue working until departure. All wages will be converted to relief packages as promised." A visible wave of relief passed through the assembled prisoners. They had found purpose in their labour, and losing it before departure would have felt like one more thing taken from them. Ernst spoke up next, his English now nearly fluent after months of practice. "Sir, will we be allowed to write to the guards after we return home?" Richardson hadn't considered this, but the request spoke to the genuine relationships that had formed. "I don't see why not. You'll be civilians again. Write to whoever you want." The following weeks were bittersweet. The prisoners continued their work with dedication, while also beginning the process of saying goodbye to the guards who had become, if not quite friends, then at least respected acquaintances. Personal items were exchanged. Addresses were written down with promises to write. Private Chen gave Klaus his home address in San Francisco. "If you ever make it to America again," Chen said, his voice thick with emotion, "come find me. I'll make you a real Chinese meal. We'll throw away half of it together and laugh about it." Klaus embraced him, both men crying openly, the barriers of war and nationality dissolved in shared humanity. June 28, 1945, brought the day of departure. 67 men boarded transport trucks bound for the port in Mobile, their faces reflecting determination mixed with apprehension. They carried letters of recommendation from Captain Richardson and personal notes from guards who had witnessed their transformation. They would return to Germany as ambassadors of an unexpected truth, that their enemy had been stronger not just militarily, but fundamentally, that abundance and generosity were more powerful than propaganda and hate, that even in defeat, dignity was possible. As the trucks rolled through the gates, Sergeant Miller watched from his post, his expression contemplative. Klaus had sought him out that morning, one final conversation before departure. "Thank you for showing us the truth," Klaus had said, "even when it was hard. especially when it was hard. Miller had shaken his hand, holding it firmly. Go home and build something better. That's all any of us can do now. The 67 men scattered across Germany, returning to a nation in ruins. Klaus found his family's home in Hamburg reduced to rubble, his parents killed in the bombing campaigns. He rebuilt on the same plot of land, using skills learned at Camp Aliceville. Ernst discovered his wife and daughter had survived in Dresden, malnourished but alive. He wept when he gave them the first care package he had earned through his labour, unable to explain fully why the simple food meant so much. Hans returned to his family farm to find it stripped bare, but he knew how to coax crops from difficult soil, knowledge gained from American agricultural techniques he had observed and learned. But the story's most remarkable chapter came in November 1970, when Captain Richardson, long retired and living in Atlanta, received a letter from Klaus Müller. The former POW had become a teacher in Hamburg, and he was organizing a reunion at the site where Camp Aliceville had stood. 51 of the original 67 prisoners confirmed they would attend, traveling from across Germany and beyond. Richardson made the journey, as did Sergeant Miller and Private Chen. Other guards who had served at the camp came as well, curious to see what had become of the men they had once guarded. They gathered in what had been the mess hall, now a community centre. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and yes, there was laughter. Klaus, his hair now grey, made a joke about American food waste that brought down the house. In that moment, surrounded by people who had once been divided by war but were now united by shared history, the true victory became clear. Not the military victory of 1945, but the human victory of choosing understanding over hatred, generosity over vengeance, and truth over comfortable lies. Ernst stood to speak, his voice still strong in his 70s. We came to America as prisoners, believing we were superior, he said, his English now perfect. We left as humbled men who understood that true strength is not in taking from the weak, but in giving to those who have nothing. America did not defeat us with weapons alone. America defeated us by showing us what we could never be while following men who valued power over humanity. He raised his glass. To the guards who showed us kindness, to the country that fed its enemies, to the truth that set us free. Private Chen, now a successful restaurant owner in San Francisco, raised his own glass. To Klaus, he said, who came to my restaurant in 1963 and ate everything on his plate. No waste, never waste. The room erupted in laughter and applause. Klaus had indeed made it to America, sponsored by Chen and Richardson, eventually becoming a citizen. He had brought his family, built a life, and spent his remaining years teaching students about the dangers of propaganda and the power of facing uncomfortable truths. The reunion proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, when nations fed their citizens lies and sent them to die for false causes, kindness and truth could build bridges across any divide. The German prisoners who had been shocked by American abundance had learned the most important lesson of all, that real victory is not measured in territory conquered or enemies defeated, but in hearts and minds transformed by the simple act of treating enemies as fellow human beings deserving of truth, dignity, and a second chance.